All right, welcome to The Explainer. We're going to talk about a name pretty much everyone knows, Christopher Columbus. But I'm willing to bet the story you learned in school, it's packed with myths. The real story is so much more complicated, way more controversial, and honestly, it changed the world in ways you might not even realize. Okay, let's just jump right in and tear the Band-Aid off. The two biggest myths, the ones we all heard, right here. First, he didn't discover America. I mean, millions of people already lived there. And second, this whole idea he was trying to prove the world was round? Nope. Almost every educated person at the time already knew it was. So, what is the real story then? Well, to really get a grip on his legacy, we've got to start with the man himself. And who he was, well, that's a mystery that, believe it or not, science is just now starting to piece together. So for hundreds of years, the accepted story was pretty straightforward. Columbus was the son of a weaver from Genoa, a regular guy trying to climb the social ladder. But get this, recent DNA evidence just completely flips that on its head. A massive 22-year study that just wrapped up in 2024 suggests he was actually a Sephardic Jew from Spain, and he might have been hiding his identity to escape the Spanish Inquisition. I mean, that changes everything, right? Suddenly, his motivations aren't just about finding gold. Was he also looking for a safe haven? And that brings us to maybe the most stubborn myth of all. You know the one. The story of Columbus, the lone genius, arguing with a bunch of people who thought the world was flat. Yeah, that whole image, it's totally bogus. It's a story that was literally made up in the 1800s. The truth is, back in the 15th century, any educated person, sailors, scholars, you name it, knew the world was a sphere. They'd known it for centuries, all the way back to the ancient Greeks. See, the real argument wasn't about the Earth's shape at all. It was about its size. Everybody agreed you could sail west to get to the east. The big question, the million-dollar question, was how far is it? And on that, Columbus wasn't just wrong. He was dangerously wrong. And you can see just how wrong he was right here. Look at this. The Portuguese, who were, by the way, the absolute expert navigators of the day, their estimates were way, way closer to the real number. They turned him down not because they were stuck in the past, but because they were good at math. They knew his plan was basically a suicide mission. The only thing that saved him from sailing off into oblivion was bumping into an entire continent he had no idea was there. So, Portugal says, no thanks. What does Columbus do? He goes to their biggest rival, Spain. Now, you got to understand the timing here. It's 1492. The Spanish monarchy has just finished the Reconquista. They've captured Granada, the last Muslim stronghold. They're feeling confident, but they're also desperate to catch up with Portugal, who's dominating all the trade routes around Africa. So they decide to roll the dice on this Columbus guy. So over the next decade, Columbus sails back and forth 4 times. But look at the difference between that first trip and the second one. The first voyage in 1492, it was a tiny fleet, just a scouting mission. But when he comes back just a year later, he's got a massive fleet of 17 ships. The mission had already changed. It wasn't about exploring anymore. It was about conquest. And that shift would have absolutely devastating consequences for the people who already lived there. And check this out. Before he even left the dock, the Spanish crown gave him this incredible contract. It basically gave him almost medieval, feudal lord-level power over any lands he found. He'd be admiral, viceroy, and governor for life. Plus, he'd get to keep 10% of all the wealth discovered. It's a deal that just screams desperation on Spain's part. And it totally set the stage for the absolute tyranny and, eventually, his own spectacular downfall. This number, it's just staggering. It represents the human cost of that first contact. Within just a few decades, the native Taino population in the Caribbean crashed by as much as 90%. And it wasn't just one cause. It was this horrific cocktail of new diseases they had no immunity to, straight-up violence, and a brutal system of forced labor. Columbus might have been a decent navigator, but as a governor, he was an absolute disaster. He couldn't find the gold and spices of Asia he'd promised, and he ruled so brutally that everyone, the Spanish colonists included, suffered. Eventually, the reports getting back to Spain were just too awful to ignore. The crown had finally had enough. In the year 1500, they sent an official over who promptly arrested Columbus and shipped him back to Spain in chains. He was stripped of all his power. So he was a failure as a governor, totally disgraced in his own lifetime. But here's the massive twist. In failing, Columbus accidentally kicked off what many historians argue is the single most important event in all of modern history. What he started is what we now call the Columbian Exchange. And we're not just talking about gold and spices here. We're talking about a massive, permanent swap of plants, animals, technology, ideas, and, tragically, diseases. It reconnected two halves of the planet that had been biologically separate for thousands of years. And this exchange literally reshaped the entire world. I mean, think about it. Before 1492, there were no tomatoes in Italy, no potatoes in Ireland, no chili peppers in Thailand, and no chocolate in Switzerland. It's crazy, right? And going the other way, horses and cattle completely changed life in the Americas, while things like wheat and sugarcane created brand new economies. But of course, the exchange also brought those terrible diseases, like smallpox, which caused the most devastation by far. And one of the biggest, most mind-blowing effects of all this was on people, the global population specifically. When these high-calorie, easy-to-grow crops from the Americas, we're talking potatoes and corn, got to the rest of the world, they completely changed what people ate. Suddenly there's more food, more security, and that fueled a massive population explosion across Europe, Africa, and Asia. The world's population basically quadrupled in the centuries that followed. So, all of this brings us to today. How are we supposed to think about a guy whose legacy is just so full of contradictions? On one hand, his actions connected the globe. On the other, they kicked off centuries of unbelievable destruction. And that, right there, is the heart of the whole debate about Columbus now. His legacy today is, to put it mildly, fiercely debated. You see it everywhere, in the arguments over statues, over holidays. It really boils down to two completely opposite stories. In one, he's the hero, the visionary who brought the world together and started the modern era. In the other, he's the villain, the tyrant whose arrival kicked off centuries of colonization, slavery, and the wiping out of entire peoples. And a lot of historians now, like Professor Valdomiro Lorenzo here, don't mince words. They argue that what happened in the Caribbean, that very first point of contact, absolutely fits the modern definition of genocide. When you combine the direct violence, the enslavement, and the apocalyptic death toll from disease, it led to the almost complete annihilation of the people on those islands. And what about Columbus himself? Well, he died pretty much in obscurity, stripped of the titles and the riches he thought he deserved. And the craziest part? To his dying day, he refused to believe he'd found a new world. He was convinced he had just reached the edges of Asia. It took other people, guys like Amerigo Vespucci, to realize what a monumental discovery it was. And, well, Amerigo is the one who got his name on the map, isn't he? So in the end, there's just no easy answer for Christopher Columbus. He was a brilliant sailor and a terrible governor. His voyages connected the planet and sparked incredible growth. But they also opened the door to an era of colonization and devastation that we're still dealing with today. So the question he leaves us with is a really tough one. How should we remember historical figures who cast both light and shadow? That's not just a question about him. It's a question we're all still trying to figure out.